Is my voice audible?
Good morning. Your voice is breaking.
Hello.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Is my voice audible?
Yeah, sir, it's a bit clear.
Great. Thanks. For some of you, if you are having any audio problems, please try to change your headset. Or maybe you can join from through other routes. All right, so let's get into this session. So yesterday we talked about some basic of clinical research. Right? So what is clinical trial, and who are the different parties involved in conducting clinical trials? Can anyone tell me who are the different parties involved in conducting clinical trials? Yesterday we discussed about few names, right? Different parties. Example: investigator,
Sponsor, regulatory, CRO, and subjects.
Investigator, sponsor.
okay, yeah, that's correct. And then what are the different departments in clinical research? Maybe what are the different departments in a CRO? Yesterday we discussed
Clinical operation, data management,
correct.
Placement,
biostatistics,
Business development, quality assurance,
regulatory affairs, medical affairs.
and
medical
pharmacovigilance.
writer as well.
All right, great, thank you. Thanks so much. So I'm happy that you were able to hear my voice yesterday. Right, thank you so much for answering those questions. Let me share my screen.
Sir, sorry to interrupt, but your voice is a bit low.
Is it low for everyone?
Yes, sir. A lot of disturbance is also coming, sir.
Okay, let me.
Yeah, it's break sometimes.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yes,
sir.
it's fine.
Yeah, sir.
Yeah, is it okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yes, sir. You can continue.
Great, thank you. All right. So today we will again go through some of the basics in clinical research. Yesterday we talked about a bit of clinical research, but today we will continue with the same. There are a few more topics on basics of clinical research. So first is yesterday I was talking about giving you a brief idea on how the clinical research process, what is the clinical research process, right? First is what is basically a clinical research, and then I was trying to give you some basic introduction about preclinical trials, right? So clinical is always human trials, research on humans, right? To test the safety and efficacy of new drugs. On top of it, we also have preclinical, right? Preclinical trials or animal trials. And then on top of it, we have drug discovery, right? So preclinical trials and then clinical trials, all this happens on new drugs, right? So first the drugs needs to be identified, right? The process, clinical research process is only applicable only when you have a new drugs in place, right? So first the overall cycle, it starts with the drug discovery, right? The drugs will need to be identified, right? So how the drugs are identified? Yesterday we talked about sponsors. Sponsors are the pharmaceutical companies who do develop the new drugs, right? So a sponsor team consists of a lot of people, the medical monitors, the pharmacologists, the doctors, right? Let's talk about, if we talk about one pharmaceutical company like Novartis or GSK, right? They have their own scientists or doctors or medical monitors or medical writers, right? Who sit together based on the therapeutic area, how these new drugs are discovered. Drugs are discovered based on the therapeutic area. They have their own therapeutic, they have their own scientist who works on the therapeutic area, and then they bring up these new drugs, right? So they have a business intelligence team who gives an heads up, hey, this is prevalent in the market. Can you start working on this molecule, right? And then they will start identifying those molecules. So at a high level, these are all the steps, right, for drug discovery and development. Target selection, target validation, drug lead or selection, lead optimization, preclinical testing, clinical testing. So target selection is basically identification of the disease, identification or basically the target. So at a high level, it's a disease, but then in terms of targets or the cells that are getting impacted. In case of HIV, how the virus binds to the DNA, and then how it gets multiplicated. So they will identify the target, and then they will start validating the target. What are the different cells that are involved, right, in duplication of the virus. And then drug or lead selection, they have a lot of chemical compounds. Since pharmaceutical companies, they have been in this industry from quite some time, so they may have different leads, different drugs. And these days it's again very much easy, right? By using bioinformatic techniques, they will have a group of drugs, and then they will start throwing the leads on the target, and then they will see which drug is actually binding it to the target, like how you see it as an antigen and antibody reaction. So which they will have a lot of, they will start testing a lot of leads or drugs, right? And then they will throw those on the target, and then they will identify which lead is actually binding it to the target. And then lead optimization. So once the lead is identified, then lead optimization is shaping of the chemical compound to exactly bind it to the target. So once the chemical compound or the drug or lead is identified, then that has to go through the preclinical and clinical testing process. So yesterday we were talking about some part of clinical trials. So once the drug is identified, it has to undergo preclinical trials or animal trials, right? That will be sent to animals, that will be sent to some, like how we have contract research organizations. So there are some organizations who can also help the sponsors in conducting the preclinical trials. And then, so we are not related to preclinical trials, but then we will talk more on the clinical trials, right? So once the preclinical trials are completed, and then the drug is shown safe and efficacy on animals, and then the drug is authorized to move ahead with the clinical trials, only then the drugs are only the drugs will receive to the clinical trial phase. So yeah, yesterday we were talking about some applications as well. In IND is investigational new drug. The sponsors have to file these applications to the government agencies to get the approval at each step, right? For preclinical, clinical, right? They need to submit an applications to the government to get the approval to move ahead with the clinical trials, right? So once they get an approval for conducting the clinical trials, right? Now they have to hire a CRO. Otherwise, if they are capable of doing the trial, that's fine. Otherwise, they need to hire a CRO for conducting the clinical trials. Right. So yesterday we talked about the definition. So clinical trials is basically a systematic investigation in human subjects for evaluating the safety and efficacy of new drugs. So yeah, yesterday we talked about what is safety, what is efficacy, and what is a new drug, right? And then yeah, please remember clinical trials always involves humans. Clinical trial is a mainstay for bringing out the new drugs to the market. So yeah, this is the only way. It cannot, we cannot skip clinical trials because of the government regulations, right? So all drugs have to pass through the clinical trial phase, and then they need to prove, the drugs will need to be proved on the safety and efficacy to get those drugs into the market. So as by now you may be aware, clinical trials are done in 4 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then phase 4. Phase 1 is called as human pharmacology phase, right? So yeah, yesterday I was mentioning clinical trials are not easy, right? Clinical trials are very big, right? It will take altogether 10 years, approximately 10 years, right? And then they are very big, and they are resource intensive and then cost intensive. That means a lot of cost is involved, a lot of people are involved in conducting the clinical trials. Right. So yeah, since it has to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. So phase 1 initially is the first phase wherein the drugs are tested on on healthy volunteers. So phase 1 is basically it's only healthy volunteers. So there are only little number of patients whom the drugs are tested on. It is around 20 to 30 patients, right? Healthy volunteers, the drugs will be tested on healthy volunteers. And then the objective of phase 1 is to determine the safety of the drug. So the primary focus for all the pharmaceutical companies and then the government agencies is to ensure that the drug is proven safe first. Safety is the first aspect, right, that they should be looking out for. And then they will test on those 20 to 30 or 40 patients, and they will record the data of the patients, of the healthy volunteers. And if the drug is proven safe on those healthy volunteers, then the drug can move to the next level called as phase 2, right? Phase 2 is therapeutic exploratory trials, wherein we wanted to explore more on how the drug is performing, right? We want to test on little higher number of patients. Now it is patients. Phase 1 is done on healthy volunteers, but then phase 2 is done on patients with a little higher number of patients, around hundreds of patients who are involved in for conducting the clinical trials, right? So exploring, now we wanted to explore not only the safety but also the efficacy. Now we have to watch phase 2. The objective of phase 2 is to further explore the efficacy, how the drug is working on the disease, right? Apart from how the drug is causing the side effects, we also want to know safety along with efficacy of the drug. So, and then phase 3 is called therapeutic confirmatory trials, wherein the drug is further explored. Phase 2, they started with patients, with hundreds of patients, but now phase 3, we wanted to confirm whether this drug is proving the safety and efficacy by including higher number of patients. And then phase 3 are multicentric trials. Multicentric trials, that means patients that are included in these trials from different areas. The trial can happen in US, UK, Japan, Canada, right? All these areas, they have, we wanted to test in different races, different food habitats, right? Different environmental conditions, right? So phase 3 is therapeutic confirmatory trials. It happens on patients with thousands of patients, right? I worked on one phase 3 trial which has 25,000 patients, right? So yeah, phase 3 is always very big, right? And then phase 3, my trial, 25,000 patients, it went on for 5 years. Only phase 3, it went on for 5 years. So you can just, maybe you can just think how much time it took for the clinical trial, phase 2, phase 1, and then the drug discovery. Right, so those are called phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials, the objective is again to measure the safety and efficacy of the drug, but then in higher number of population, thousands of patients. It can be 10,000, 15,000, or 2,000. It is purely dependent on the drug and then the sponsor. And then phase 4 trials. So once the phase 3 trials are completed, then those trials, if the drug proved safe and effective, right? If the data of the patients,
Your voice is breaking.
I have not changed anything
Hello.
from my side.
Your voice is
Is it for everyone?
okay.
No, sir, we are good.
Yeah. Maybe in case if you have any concerns, please try to message in the chat box so that I can look and then change. But I have not changed anything here. All right.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So phase 4 trials, once the phase 3 trials are completed, right, then the again, as I mentioned, everything or every starting from the drug development, from preclinical and then the clinical, the pharmaceutical companies will have to closely work with the government agencies and then the doctors, right, to get the necessary approvals for conducting the clinical trials. Like how I mentioned about IND is investigational new drug, right? Wherein they need to get that IND approval to start with phase 1. In the same way, after completion of the phase 3, they need to submit an application called as new drug application. After phase 3, once they submit that NDA, new drug application, they are good to release that if the drug proves safe and effective. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, there is a process, right? So the trials, yesterday I have shown you one cycle. The patients are involved, doctors are involved, and then the drug data is captured, and then the data will go for analysis. So at each phase, that process will happen. So phase 3 is completed. A lot of patients are involved. The doctors will have to enter the data of all the patients. And then if the data is showing safe and effective, those drugs can be launched into the market with the approval from the government. Right, so once that is done, then there is a next phase called as phase 4. Phase 4 is called as PMS studies, post-marketing surveillance studies, wherein all the pharmaceutical companies are asked to do one more phase of the clinical trial. Those are called PMS studies. There is no restriction in terms of the subject numbers, how many subjects that needs to be used. It's purely the sponsor's decision how many subjects are used. But then this is conducted just to ensure if there are no if there are again, it is again for the safety and efficacy. But then we wanted to further explore and see if there are not any missed safety and efficacy events. Right, so this is a whole story, but then we can again learn that in our next sessions. Right, so clinical trials are done in 4 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. It takes about, yeah, I was talking about this also. It takes about 10 to 12 years and the US dollars of $800 million to bring one new drug to the market. So, yeah, this is just the approximate figures, and then this is the cost which you see here is from very old. This is a very old slide. Now the cost has grown very high, right? So it will take a lot of years to complete phase 1. So my trial, which I was mentioning, only phase 3, I worked on 5 years, right? And then yeah, and then the cost of the trial for only for phase 3, they have charged $100,000, right? So yeah, for every 10,000 to 3,000 drug molecules screened, only one reaches to the market. So not all the clinical trials will go until the drug approvals. Can all those, not all drugs can reach the market. So yeah, the same example which I was giving, right? My trial, phase three, right? Wherein my company has charged hefty amount to the sponsor, and it is one of the visibility trial, right, for that company. But then the phase three, there are 25,000 patients. Out of 25,000 patients, 1,000 patients died. The trial is of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, which is not expected. It is expected as per the protocol, but then the data did not show, after analysis, the data does not show that the drug is safe. And hence, even after spending a lot of years and then a lot of money, it did not reach the market. Right, so not all drugs, even those are tested, can reach the market. It needs to prove all this safety and efficacy in all these steps. All right, trial regulations. As I was mentioning yesterday, there are regulatory bodies in India and any other countries like FDA, DCGI. So they have their own regulations, how the drugs will need to be controlled. So DCGI, Drug Control General of India under CDSO, has the prime responsibility for regulating the clinical trials in India. So DCGI is the regulatory body who controls the drugs in India. And then there are other guidelines like Declaration of Helsinki. We will talk about that, and World Medical Association, and then who provides ethical guidelines and principles to the physicians and other participants and human subjects. So these are all some of the guidelines wherein apart for all the sponsors and for all the investigators and then the CROs who are conducting the trials, they have to follow DCGI guidelines and some general guidelines of Declaration of Helsinki. And then ICMR also has some guidelines for conducting the clinical trials. And then on top of it, we have ICHGCP. ICHGCP is International Conference of Organization Good Clinical Practice. We will talk about this in our next session. So this is one of the, ICHGCP is one of the international scientific quality standard for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting of clinical trials. So the sponsors will have to follow. And then ICH-GCP guidelines in line with WHO, ICH, USFDA. So the GCP is an international quality standard, as I mentioned. So a lot of regulatory bodies, right, from different regions have came together and then started writing this GCP. So GCP is a very important topic we will discuss in our next sessions. And then there are some other acts, Drug and Cosmetic Acts 1940 and Schedule Y. So Schedule Y is a document, it's a document which will tell about what kinds of applications that needs to be submitted to the government, right, at each phase. Application 122, 122A, 122B, it talks about a lot of applications, like how yesterday I was giving you an example, right, for submitting your passport. You will go into passportseva.com and from there you identify which appropriate application will you need to submit. So this Schedule Y will help the sponsors and then in identifying applications and then submitting that applications to the government agencies for their drug. So yeah, Schedule Y is this basically the requirements and guidelines on clinical trials for import and manufacture of new drugs. There are some requirements and then the guidelines. Trial stakeholders, we talked about this trial stakeholders yesterday, but then again, We will discuss that. So sponsors, as we discussed, and then CRO, we talked about CRO, investigators, a regulatory body, and then the patients. But then the one which you see new is ethics committee. So ethics committee, yesterday I have just given you a hint of ethics committees or the local bodies. Right. So within the hospitals, so every hospital, even maybe the bigger hospitals who are conducting the clinical trials, will have their own ethics committee. So suppose if I talk about Apollo Hospital or Care Hospital, they have their own ethics bodies who reviews the clinical trial information like protocol and other information which is supplied to the investigators. They review that information and then they give an approval to the investigators for conducting the clinical trials. We will talk about ethics committee. We have a separate session for that, for all this, even for sponsors, investigators, and then yeah, we have different sessions for each of them. So sponsors, we have sponsors. So this is again a small intro on each of the ones. So sponsors, as today I have just asked you to remember, sponsor is a pharmaceutical company, right? So sponsor is a person who takes the prime responsibility for initiation, management, and for financing of the clinical trial. So sponsor is the person who has the drug, who has developed the drug, and he want to do a clinical trial. He has to do a clinical trial, right, for getting that drug into the market. So he should take care of initiation, management, and financing. So initiation, he need to select the CROs, or he need to have a team who can do it and manage it. Manages, there are different parties who are involved in conducting the clinical trials, right? He need to manage everyone, and then finance, ultimately everyone goes for money, right? So even the doctors, even the CROs, right? So he need to finance that money for conducting those clinical trials. And then CRO, yesterday we talked about CRO. CRO is contract research organizations, which are contracted by the sponsors to perform one or more of the sponsors file related duties. So if sponsor is not capable of conducting the clinical trials, maybe he did not have team like GSK. GSK is a company wherein they do not have much bigger teams of, yesterday what we talked about, the medical writing, data management. They will not have bigger teams. They may have one or two people, one in data management, one in clinical operations, and then one in medical writing. So they will not have a bigger teams. The sponsors will not have it. So they can hire a CRO, right, for conducting for conducting or managing their trials for them, and then obviously with money, right? So can any one of you tell me some names of the sponsor, maybe the sponsor companies?
Parexel, sir.
Okay.
Dr. Reddy's.
Pfizer.
Asking about sponsor, someone has told Excel, someone Pfizer, someone
Johnson and Johnson.
Johnson and Johnson.
Yes.
Sorry.
Cipla.
GS.
Arabindo. Cipla, sir. Cipla.
Sorry?
Novartis. Cipla, Novartis. Ranbaxy. Ranbaxy.
Glenmark.
Alembic. Slayback.
GlaxoSmithKline.
GSK already written. All right. These are good numbers, but then I want you to go back today and then I want you to search top 10 pharmaceutical companies or sponsors. Research.
Paraxel is a CRO, I guess. So Paraxel is a CRO, I guess. Is it a sponsor?
I will come there. So I want you to search this in Google, and again I will ask the same question tomorrow. Okay. So yeah, as someone has rightly said, Paraxel is not a sponsor. Paraxel is a CRO. So now that you must have understood the difference between sponsor and then the CRO. Sponsor is the pharmaceutical companies who do develop these new drugs, and then CROs or contract research organizations who can take some responsibility from the sponsor, but then CRO will not never develop a new drug. They only conduct the clinical trials for sponsors. Example, if GSK is giving a trial to Paraxel will do the clinical trial for GSK drug. Right, so that is the difference between sponsor and then the CRO. So yeah, if you search sponsor names, you will see a lot of new names. And not only this is only limited, and then I don't consider as, and then when I say sponsor, please remember sponsors. So they are the ones who can develop the new drugs, right? And then they have capability to invest huge amount of money, right, to develop these drugs. I don't think this one. I don't think this one, right? Yeah, just search the names. You will see more names, new names. Maybe you might not be aware of, and you will get to know. I will ask the same question tomorrow. All right, and CRO. Can anyone tell me any names of CRO? So someone has told me Paraxel.
Jubilant.
Sir, IQVIA.
Right?
PPD.
Sorry,
IQIVIA.
that is also written.
Cognizant.
Oh,
Paraxel.
this is also written.
Cognizant.
Paraxel is already there.
Cleantech.
Abbott.
Novartis.
Covance.
Abbott. Someone has told me
No.
about Abbott is not a CRO. It's a
Novartis?
Yeah, Novartis.
Paraxel.
CSI.
Syneos Health.
Syneos, madam. SYNEOS.
Dr. Reddy's.
Novartis.
Please note, Dr. Reddy's is not a CRO. It is,
PPD.
all right. Okay. Yeah. Again, the same homework. You will have to search the top 10 CROs, contract research organizations. Top 10, right? Top 10 contract research organization. Contract research organization. So again, yeah, some of you have rightly said Syneos, Covance, PPD, Paraxel, right? Those IQVIA, I agree. These are all contract research organizations. So you should be knowing this because these are all your companies. Either you can,
TCS.
yeah, that's a good point. So I will not call Cognizant, TCS, or Accenture. These are all not, these companies are not called CROs. These are all IT companies, right?
Data management companies.
Right. So these are all IT companies, but who do deliver bits and pieces of work for their sponsors. So there is a difference between a CRO and then IT companies. So CRO, I have shown you a structure of CRO, how many departments are involved. So CRO is contract research organizations, which is fully equipped. That means they have bigger team of people who can help these sponsors for conducting the clinical trials. That means they have clinical operations, starting from clinical operations, medical writing, data management, pharmacovigilance, and then medical statistical analysis, right? And then quality assurance, and then medical writing, regulatory affairs, etc. So they are fully equipped, contract research organizations, they fully equipped for the sponsors to conduct the clinical trials. But then these IT companies, they do bits and pieces of work. They are not full CROs, but then their nature of work is fully into IT services, right? But then Cognizant, being it a IT company, it has entered into pharmacovigilance and into data management. And I think that they do some part of statistical analysis as well. But then they will not do the full, they are not called as full service CROs. They will not do a CRO service, meaning they will not, they do not have all the departments for the sponsors, but then they can help the sponsors in some areas for conducting this work, right? Even the same for TCS and Accenture. I understand that Cognizant, TCS, and Accenture have pharmacovigilance, data management, and some sort of statistical analysis, but then they do not have clinical operations, and then they do not have regulatory affairs, right? So that is a major difference between these two. All right, so we can discuss that
Sir,
again. Yeah.
sir, Hetero Mylan comes under CRO or sponsor, sir?
Hetero and Mylan. So these two are pharmaceutical companies, right? So it comes under sponsor, but then I don't consider as the biggest pharmaceutical companies, right? So please do search your in Google, as I mentioned, you will see new names.
So
And then
recently
Hetero,
they told remdesivir for COVID. This
sorry, what is that?
Hetero and Mylan remdesivir drug for COVID.
Mhm.
Remdesivir, sir, COVID.
Yeah, I understand that, but what is your question?
That means trials are conducted by Hetero and Mylan, no, sir?
Right.
For that, so it comes under CRO, right? I mean sponsor. It comes under sponsor or CRO?
These are pharmaceutical companies, so these are
Okay.
sponsors.
Sponsors, okay.
So they may hire a CRO, Hetero can hire a CRO for conducting the clinical trials. And yeah, there is a different setup within BA, bioavailability and bioequivalence studies. We will talk about that a little later. So for bioavailability and bioequivalence studies, they Hetero has their own CRO. It's not called as contract research organizations. They call it as clinical research organizations. We will talk about that tomorrow. Once you get these names, I will tell you an example. So some
Sir?
generic.
So sorry to interrupt. Actually, the companies who have their own formulation and production departments, they come under sponsors or CROs.
Anything who do the development, right?
Okay.
They are the sponsors.
So there'll be the sponsors, not CROs, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's
Okay,
what
sir.
we will talk about much about on it tomorrow. Once others get the names of sponsors companies, tomorrow we will talk about what is the difference between the biggest pharmaceutical companies and generic pharmaceutical companies. There are some generic makers also, right? So the Hetero has a lot of generic, and in India there are a lot of pharmaceutical companies who do develop the generic drugs, right? So we will talk about that. And then for that, they don't need to conduct a clinical trial. It's all BA/BE trials, bioavailability and bioequivalence studies. So that trial, those studies are little different than clinical trials. There is a slight difference between that. We'll talk about that tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. So yeah, we were talking about the sponsors and then the COOs, right? So investigators, and then moving ahead with investigators. Investigator is responsible for conduct of a clinical trial at the site. So we will talk about all these roles. In our next session, we will get into each sponsor's roles and responsibilities, and then investigator. But for now, please understand, investigator is the doctor who is conducting the clinical trial at the trial site, and then trial site is the hospital. And then ethics committee, as I mentioned, it's a hospital authority who is at the hospital, who reviews the protocol and understands the protocol, and then they give an approval to the doctors, investigators for conducting the trials. So they mainly focus on these areas, right? Safety and well-being of the subjects involved, and to provide assurance. So the hospital authorities, they don't want their patients to be exposed to new drugs. So they want to review whatever the documents that sponsor has provided, whatever the investigator is willing to conduct the trial, and then they review all the documents in these areas. They wanted to ensure the patient's rights, safety, and well-being of the trial participants. And then finally, the study subjects. The study subjects are the patients who are individual who participate in this study. And essential documents are the documents which are these are all essential trial documents, individually and collectively evaluates the conduct of the trial and preserves the integrity of the data. So just one thing to note here is documentation is very much important in clinical trials. So each document has its own significance, right? So if it is not documented, the quality assurance team in clinical research, they say, it's a saying that if it is not documented, then it is not done. It is not performed at all. So yeah, it's very much important that all the documents are kept very safe. And then the ICH GCP talks about some important documents for conducting the clinical trials. So those documents will need to be kept safe, because those will be evaluated. So there will be some audits or inspections from the regulatory bodies to the sites or to the CROs or to the sponsors. Sponsors may be audited by the FDA, or sites may be audited by the FDA, right? So all those documents will need to be kept very safe, because those documents will help for evaluating the conduct of the trial, how the trial was conducted. Is it conducted as per the protocol or other ethics and all other regulations? So these documents demonstrate the compliance of the investigators and sponsors or CROs with GCP and all applicable regulatory requirements. And the documents include base records, laboratory data, CRFs, randomization key, other investigation records, and no objection certificates of ethics committee, DCGI, ICF, and CRO to sponsor agreement. So these documents, examples as in patient data. For suppose today I am a doctor. One patient has came to me, right? Today is his visit. So I have given him a drug, and then I collected the blood sample, right? I sent that blood sample to lab. But after 5 months, when FDA is auditing me, FDA has asked, can you show me patient number 3 lab report? So I was not able to find that report, lab report, the one which was tested. But I entered that data, I entered all his values. He has got blood sugar, this, and then urea, creatinine, etc. But then I was not able to trace the document, the lab report. So FDA concern, all the regulatory bodies or the auditors, they don't believe in that data. There need to be a clear proof from where this data has been obtained. So they wanted to have the document, the lab report. From lab report, the doctors will be entering the data on some other systems called as electronic data capture systems. So when they are reviewing the data, when auditors are reviewing the electronic data capture, so they will ask for a proof from where this data has come. So if they are not able to produce those laboratory data, so then that data is not valid. So hence these documents are called essential documents, which will help in evaluating the clinical trial, whether that has been conducted as per regulatory bodies, regulations, ICGCP, etc. So clinical trials in India. So clinical trials are different than routine. So yeah, clinical trials are not same. It involves like how when we go to any hospital, so the doctors will prescribe the medications, and then if it is cured, then we will not go, or otherwise sometimes we will go as per our wish. But then clinical trials are little different. They follow a standard process. That means they have a protocol. Protocol is a document, right? There are a lot of signatures. ICF informed consent form will need to be collected, and then the doctors will prescribe the medications, and then the doctors will ask you to come on a certain date, right? Will ask the patients to come on certain dates. It can be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, based on the protocol, right? So this is not a similar as a routine medical care, but then that is a little different. So India became a member of WTO in 1995 and agreed to adhere to the product and process patient patent regimen from 2005. And India is provides excellent environment for clinical trials in terms of less cost, speed, quality parameters of and then as you may be aware, um, India is one of the global hub for conducting the clinical trials because there are a lot of patients, there is a lot of patient population, and then there are a lot of diseases, right, in India, wherein they have, and we also have a lot of education, the doctors, right, who can help in conducting the clinical trials, patient population, and then in terms of cost also it's very less when we compare with other countries. So study team at the trial site. So who we for now we were talking about site. Site is a hospital who conducts the clinical trial, right? Site is and then we are also talking about investigator. Investigator is a doctor who conducts the clinical trials. But study team, we call it a study team, who works at the hospital or who works on that particular study. We call it as clinical trials. We call it clinical trials as studies. So for one study, there is a team at the hospital who will be working. It's not only the investigator, there are a team who are working on that trial. So they are investigators. So investigator, as you know, is a doctor. And then co-investigator. Co-investigator is also a doctor who works very closely with the investigator and helping the investigator, right? And then study coordinator. Study coordinator is basically a person who is with life science or B pharmacy or M pharmacy.
Your
Who
voice is
knows?
breaking, sir.
Yeah. Is it okay for everyone?
Okay,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
For me also it's breaking actually in between.
So again, I have not changed. Do others also find the same?
No, sir.
Yeah, yeah, in between your voice is breaking.
Is it okay now?
Yeah,
Yes,
it's
sir.
good now.
All right. Yeah, the study team at trial site include investigators, co-investigators, and study coordinators, and then nurse pharmacists. So yeah, there is a team who works at this site. It's not only the doctors. The doctors will have a team who will help in conducting the clinical trials. And then unblinded person. So you will get to know this blinding and unblinding when we talk about the definitions. Right. So yeah, for now, just keep it as there are two different people. One is blinded and then unblinded. Blinded is basically the masking. They will not be able to work on some areas because they should not see the data. They should not see that data. They should not see those drugs. And then unblinded is basically they are exposed to everything, so they can see it. Right. So there are two different people, unblinded and unblinded. So this is only applicable in terms of blinded trials. And then clear delegation of duties to the study team members is essential for the smooth execution of the clinical trial. So delegation of duties, and delegation of duties is the sites will have a lot of different forms. One of the form is DOA, delegation of authority law form. Delegation of authority form wherein they have to clearly write what is the name of the person, what is his role, is he a doctor, is he an investigator or study coordinator, right? They need to mention their role, and then they need to clearly write what are the responsibilities that he is doing at the site, because they do not want others to see the data, they do not want others to perform this activity. So just for everyone to be sure who are working on this study at the site, so they need to maintain that delegation of authority law. So these are all some of the documents, essential documents, and then not the documents. These are all some of the trial duties, tasks that the sites will need to perform. The sites will have to perform, right, clinical trials. So these are all some of the tasks wherein the site study team can take up. So one is administration of ICF. Administration of ICF is taking the inform. We will talk about ICF a little later, but for now, just make sure the ICF is informed consent form. That administration is giving the form to them and then informing them what is this trial is all about, and then taking their signature is called administration of ICF. And then recruitment of subjects, selecting the patients in this trial. The doctors will do this. The doctors will recruit the patients in this study. And then correspondence with the ethics committee, CRO, or sponsors. The sites are also responsible for corresponding. Corresponding is communicating, right, with the ethics committee. Ethics committee is their hospital body. CRO is maybe if the trial is given to a CRO by the sponsor, the sites will need to inform CROs and then the sponsors. And then they also will need to take care of the storage, dispensing, accountability of the drugs, and then completing of source documents. So source documents, again, we will learn, but for now, source documents are the documents which are called original documents of the patients. They need to write, right? So there are two different documents. One is the CRF and then the source documents. So CRF is a case report form, and then source documents are basically the original documents of the patients. Right, today you must have seen when someone gets admitted in hospital, they will write case sheet, right? It is similar document wherein when patient is coming to his visits, the investigator or the CRC will start writing the information on this document called a source document, and then that data will be transcribed into a different document called as case report form. And the other one is medical management of trial subjects, reporting of SAE, serious adverse events, escalations, resolutions, management of deviations. So deviations, or maybe in case of any changes, divergence from the protocol. And the logistics management, in case if they need a phrase and if they need some other instruments for them to use, they also have to manage that. And then resolution of data inquiries. Data inquiries is basically when they write the information on the CRF, the data of the CRF will be reviewed by other people like the data management, biostatistics, right? So as earlier I mentioned, the data management team will provide a platform for the sites to enter the data. So that platform is called the CRF. So this data, the data, whatever it is entered on the CRF will be reviewed by other parties also, the medical monitor, the data manager, the statistician, etc. So they will raise a lot of inquiries. So the sites will need to respond to those data inquiries, and then site is responsible for patient visit scheduling. So as per the protocol, if the patient has come today, as per the protocol, again, the patient has to come after 10 days or 1 month. So it's the sites who will have to schedule those visits, follow up with the patients, and ensure that the trial is completed as per the protocol. And then maintenance of site master files. So there are some files, we call it as site master files. For each patients, there is a lot of data at the site. They need to take a lot of approvals, they need to take a lot of signatures, they need to collect a lot of information. So at a patient level, they keep each file, right? And this should be ready for any audits. And then compliance with GCP and applicable regulatory requirements. So the sites not only will follow the protocol of the trial, but then they should also be compliant with GCP and all regulatory requirements. Compliant is adherence. They need to adhere to all the GCP and regulatory requirements. And then tracking of payments or study grants. And then, the study team will not work for free, right? So they should be paid. So they also will need to track how much amount of money they are receiving for these trials. Maybe sometimes the patients are also paid. And then the doctors, obviously, they are paid for conducting the clinical trials. So this study team will also be tracking of their payments. All right, so I will stop here for today, and then we can go ahead with other slides in our next session. Any other questions before we end up this session?
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, as you said for Schedule Y, do we have to submit the application after each phase, like after phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, like that?
Yeah, there are some documents wherein the pharmaceutical companies will need to confirm, right? Not only even after completing the clinical trials, after completing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So even during the clinical trials also, the pharmaceutical companies will have to inform what is happening on the trial to the regulatory bodies. So the regulatory bodies should be in touch with the pharmaceutical companies. For suppose in case of serious adverse events, the serious adverse events will always be reported to the sponsor, and then those also will need to be reported to the regulatory body.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
All right.
Sir,
Yeah.
sir, in clinical phase 3, you have told that you have did the trial in the 25,000 patients were taken, sir. 25,000 subjects were taken. Hello, sir.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sir, then those all are patients or healthy volunteers, sir?
Okay. So as I told you, phase 3 never have healthy volunteers. It's only phase 1. In any trial, right, always phase 1 will have healthy volunteers. Phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4, even phase 4, it's all patients. So in my case also, all phase 3, 25,000 patients, they are patients, they are not healthy volunteers. They are patients with COPD who has chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder.
Okay, only phase 1 is healthy volunteers. Remaining all the phases are patients.
Correct.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Sir, what is the name of phase 1?
Yeah, that is human pharmacology phase.
Sir, in phase 1, only healthy volunteers they will select. So, it's not like if any patient, they should not take any patients, right? It is any mandatory protocol is there, like they should not take any patients, or
So usually, as per the ICH-GCP on any other guidelines, right? So, phase one, they start with healthy volunteers, but then it also depends on the complexity or severity of the drug. We cannot give cancer drug to a healthy patient in phase one, right?
Yeah.
So in those cases, right, so that there they can file an NTF or they can file the appropriate forms to the government and say, hey, this is this drug, and we wanted to proceed with patients only, right? So there are some restrictions in terms of the usage of the drug, but then most of the drugs will have phase one, and then they have to select the human healthy volunteers. But then there are certain exceptions.
Sir,
Okay.
is there protocol for every phase?
Yes,
So for
every phase has
sponsors,
every phase has a protocol.
So, sir, in chemo drugs, like we can take patients in phase one also.
Yeah, it's all purely dependent on the sponsor. So
Okay.
what we do is, as I mentioned, before a clinical trial comes to the CRO for clinical trial, there is a protocol which is already designed. It's the sponsor who develops the protocol and he drafts it. What is this drug is all about? Who will need to be selected? What is this phase is all about? And how the patients will receive the drug, right? And how many visits they need to receive this drug. So it's the sponsor who manages drafting the protocol or getting the approval from the regulatory body.
That means sponsor develops the protocol, sir.
That's correct.
And where do they conduct these studies? Like for phase 3, they'll gather so many patients, right? So they'll conduct in hospitals, or do they do it in a particular like open area or something that kind?
So where do we get 25,000 patients, madam? It has to happen in hospitals only. All phase 3 studies, phase 1, phase 2. Phase 1, I
Okay, but
believe.
all of them may not be the same with the same kind of disease, right? Even the 25,000 patients, even in hospitals. So, so
Phase,
so will they inform in any like newspaper or something like that?
no. Phase 3 happens at hospital. So this is again clinical trial phase. We have a lot of people to support that. Your question is valid. We may not have 25,000 patients, but then in my case, 25,000 patients are not from one hospital. They are from 1,500 sites across the globe. Right, so we will when selecting the investigators, there is a process. Maybe I will tell you that process in our little later. There is a process for selecting the investigators and then for starting the clinical trials uh, at each hospital. So before we select the doctors, all the potential doctors who are identified, the doctors will be identified. For suppose I am doing a trial, right? I want patients. I want 1,500 patients, right? For my psoriasis trial, right? So I need to select doctors. I need to select maybe 10 doctors for conducting the clinical trial. So first the doctors, the protocol will need to be specified how many sites are doing the trial and what is the target for each site, maybe 30, 40, right? Maybe 10 sites or 20 sites. So all those are already planned. And then once the protocol is there, then there are people called as contract clinical research associates who works under the clinical operations team. They identify the potential doctors who can provide 30 to 40. And this is since they are in this industry from very long time, they have the databases. From that database, they can identify who are the potential investigators in Hyderabad in dermatology who can provide around 30 to 40 patients. right? So not all 1,500 or 20,000 or 25,000 patients from the one hospital. I know it's very tough to get those many patients, but then there are different sites also, right? So as per the protocol, there are set targets, right? For each site, how many sites each site can recruit, how many patients. So based on that, they will select the potential investigators who has patient population. Not all investigators, though the doctor is very good in his therapeutic area, we cannot select the doctors because if they do not have patient population, and then they do not have the right education or expertise in conducting the clinical trials. Right?
Okay, so they need not be at one place only, right? So you said across the globe. So that phase 3 will be conducted in their respective hospitals, and they just gather data. Is it?
That's correct. So phase 3 are
Okay.
always multi-centric trials. It happens across the globes.
Okay, thank you.
If a subject is having COPD and also another disorder, is he eligible to be conducted for clinical trial?
So this is all related to protocol. How protocol want the patients to be selected, right? Every trial is different. Every protocol is different, right? Every phase, even we have protocols for phase 1 that will not match with the phase 2 protocol, right? It is the trial requirement. If the trial says, right, the patients should not have any other diseases, we will not select those patients.
Sir, and also one thing, as you said, like phase 1 human pharmacology phase is only for healthy volunteers, and that's to purely determine the safety of new drug, right? So if the drug is related to some oncology or thing, so how can they give it to a healthy volunteer?
I just mentioned it to someone else, right? Not always we use healthy volunteers. It is also dependent on the complexity and severity of the trials also. So before it comes to you for executing the clinical trial, the sponsors, they will plan what kind of patients will need to be included for that trial.
So sir, phase 1 can be optional or it is mandatory?
Phase 1 is always mandatory. It's the safety.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. That's good having this great session. But then, in case of any questions, please type your. I advise you to type your questions on the chat box. Right. During our sessions, that will help me to review and then answer your questions.
Okay.
Sir, I have a doubt, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Like for sponsors to develop a new drug, from starting from the identification of the compound to the post-marketing surveillance, we need a lot of investments, like in billions. So can we get the fund from the regulatory bodies, or only the pharmaceutical company should invest in them?
It's a pharmaceutical company who does it, right? And that's something wherein even the pharmaceutical company has to identify. It's based on the need. So most of the pharmaceutical companies, the drugs which are in the market, it's the pharmaceutical companies who do develop their drugs and then they sell it and they get the profit. If they are doing it for public's benefit, then I don't know if the government agencies can sponsor for that.
If the drug does not reaches the PMC, that is post-marketing surveillance, do we have any like insurance policy or something? Like for us, we have banks now for the compensation of some of the amount, like in billions of amount is losing if the drug does not reaches the market. So the amount will be lost, no, sir? Do we have any like insurance or something?
So insurance for the pharmaceutical companies or insurance for the patients?
Insurance for the pharmaceutical company to compensate the amounts, like some of the amount.
So that's a good question. They do use this data, right? So before they come until phase 3, they must have planned something. In my case, the trial got failed. I was thought that company is lost. The pharmaceutical company is lost because they have invested $500 million for the trial only for phase 3. I thought the company is lost now. But my second project is from the same company. That is for, I believe that is for some other indication. I don't remember that. So pharmaceutical companies are very huge, very huge. So they have huge investments, and then whatever the data that they are trying to get, they will use that for their research and analysis. They will not just, once they fail this drug, they don't throw away this data. They will use this data for altering their molecules, whatever they are, that is in the research. And then again, they will start with the trials. All right. Thank you very much for all your time. Yeah, this is very helpful. But then, yeah, please post your questions in the chat box. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.